Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for Lexi, who's worked closely with me over the past few weeks to put this together. And again, thanks to the whole board and the society for having me here. Now, the question here, which necessitates sort of this conversation, is as we define Black History Month, and we continue to celebrate it, the inevitable question, or one of the several inevitable questions that comes up is, what is this Black in Black History Month, and who is encapsulated within it, and who sort of sit outside it, and what are the intersections thereof, right? So that's what I'll be talking about briefly, and yeah. And in particular, I want to talk about, so the first thing that I want to, before I even get to breaking down the thinking behind Black History Month, I want to acknowledge this indisputable fact that Black History Month concerns itself with the history of Black people in the U.S., right? That is the stock from which Carter G. Woodson was from, and we'll talk about Carter G. shortly. That is the history that he noticed was the erasure thereof, and that's what he sought out to remedy. Now, this is very important, right? Because the global Black community is far much bigger than the American population. But there's an importance in emphasizing that reality, so as not to dilute what is going on here when we talk about Black History Month. So let's talk about the man behind Black History Month, who I already mentioned was Carter G. Woodson. Lived from 1875 to 1950, was 75 years old when he died of a heart attack. Prominent intellectual, especially, he's a prominent intellectual at any point, but when you think about what he achieved during when he did it, it's pretty incredible, right? So that's his education, got his BA in literature from Berea College in Kentucky, master's from the University of Chicago, and a PhD from Harvard, becoming the second Black person to do so after, you guys know who the first one was? W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Famous W.E.B. Du Bois. There's a quip that tends to go around when people ask him at his graduation, when somebody came up to me, one of the higher-ups said, it must be an honor for you to get this PhD from Harvard. Then he quips, the honor, I can promise you, has been Harvard's, right? So he's this kind of guy. But indeed, but yeah, that's Carter G. Woodson was the second. In fact, he was the first person, he was the only person actually to get a PhD whose parents were slaves, right? So it's a very incredible story of coming up. Then, as he was doing this, he started to notice these gaps, and we'll talk about how he thought about this. These gaps, this erasure of Black history, even as he went up the academic space, nobody was talking about Black history. So, in 1915, he formed the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which continues to exist today as ASALA. We call it ASALA, Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Then the Journal of Negro History, which again lives on today as the Journal of African American History. The Negro History Week, right, which later became Black History Week and later became Black History Month. And he published a lot of books, many of which are listed here. The most famous of which is The Miseducation of the Negro, published in 1933, which people continue to cite prominently when they talk about the need to remedy the education system and its erasure of the Black experience. So what were the very specific erasures that made Dr. Woodson sort of start to pay attention and want to give his life to remedying this erasure, right? So he says here on his website, he noted that African American contributions were overlooked, ignored, and even suppressed by the writers of history textbooks and the teachers who used them. So he was a historian through and through, But he noticed these things, right? That the achievements of the contributions of African Americans, right, of black people, were shortchanged and suppressed. Then he goes on to say this, which I thought was fantastic. This is a quote from the Miseducation of the Negro. If you teach the Negro that he has accomplished as much good as any other race, he will aspire to equality and justice without regard to race. Such an effort would upset the program of the oppressor in Africa and America. Play up before the Negro then his crimes and shortcomings. Let him learn to admire the Hebrew, the Greek, the Latin, and the Teuton. Leave the Negro to detest the man of African blood to hate himself. So here he's explaining the double-edged sword, if you will, or the two-headed monster that was the erasure of black history in these narratives, right? One, if you erase it, mainstream society, right, does not know it either and naturally predisposes itself to not look at the black community and the black story with as much gravitas as it does that of other places, whose contributions are well noted, right? Then also, but what you have to think about is what does that do to the community itself, the black community, right? Where the kids grow up, the communities grow up without knowledge of these things. So when you think about anything of virtue, when you think about philosophy, when you think about glorious histories, the Romans, the Greeks, and you're always on the outside of that, well, you may start to believe like, yeah, maybe we're no good, right? You know, historically and contemporarily. So he notices these things and you know, sort of gives his life to remedying this. Now, the first clue to what I was talking about the fact that Carter G. Woodson, even as he intended and his experience was within Black America, he was not clueless to the fact that this is a worldwide struggle. And the first clue we see is in this quote where he says, would upset the program of the oppressor in Africa and America, right? Almost twinning the plights. Colonialism, slavery and its legacies in the Americas, colonialism on the continent, which would have been at its heyday when he wrote a lot of his, when he was very active, right? So some conversations today tend to posit the African American community, right, as very distinct from the global black community and the community in Africa. And this does not have to be so, as we acknowledge here from Dr. Woodson. I've listed here 3 or so reasons why I think it's of the paramount importance that even as we recognize Black History Month as an American tradition, we also continue to think about the place of Africa within this conversation. The first point I want to make is the importance of a people with a history, as I was already explaining, as I had started to explain already. Think about, again, the ideas of supremacy, right? We can talk about them in their darkest form, right? White supremacy. Or we can talk about it when we just think about things like manifest destiny or might makes right, this Darwinistic approach to things. A lot of them are predicated on historical precedents, right? So, for example, when you think about the powers of center even in the U.S. and how they mimic Roman Greek architecture, there's a reason for that, right? How often we tend to go back to the Romans, to the Greeks, to the Vikings, in validating European expertise in different things. And that expertise is undeniable, right? But that you do that with several other places. Then, so what does it mean then when that doesn't exist for other groups of people, right? It means the very foundation of your excellence, we have it and you don't. There's a quote here that comes from a prominent historian. My students will be very familiar with this. Hugh Trevor Roper, he was speaking in the 1960s, prominent one of the most important historians of his era, European historians, British, I believe. Perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at present there is none, or very little. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, the unedifying gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. 1960 is very, very recent for this rhetoric, right? This is rhetoric that has been going on for a couple centuries at this point. But for somebody who is well positioned as he is, and very recent in history, this is very worrying when you juxtapose it with how much we know about the history of these other spaces. So the importance of situating Africa within this history is, well, let's take it back, right? Let's take it back to, what do you know about Mansa Musa, right? Which I talk about a lot in my classes. What do you know about the great Zimbabwe, right? What do you know about the ancient Egyptians? And the ancient Egyptians were African. Let's not split hairs about that. What do you know about the Songhai Empire? What do you know about the continued resistance of Ethiopia from generation to generation, century to century, and its endurance? What do you know about the commerce of the Swahili coast, right? All the way through to the resistance of the Zulu Empire in the 19th century. Once you're able to situate, and again, some of those people are just different African groups, but some of those groups I mentioned, you talk about the Mali Empire and the Songhai Empire, those are the very groups out of which many of the communities, those are the West African groups that became African American, came from, right? Those are on the coast of Africa where a lot of people were kidnapped and taken off were captured and taken off into enslavement. So that's the first reason why it's important, because Black history does not start with being shipped onto being captured and put onto a boat, right? It's very complex. It's got its glorious and its dark spots. But if we are going to start operating in an equitable and equal society, I think both those stories have to be recognized. That's number one. Number two is, not only is there continuity, but historically, the struggles have been parallel. I think one of the things that we'll know even as individuals is this idea that if you have a struggle, if you think if this was a class and you think I'm the worst professor ever, and you think that, and you'd never have this conversation with everybody else, yeah, maybe it's you. Then one day you hear that he thinks the same and she thinks the same. Now you might be like, wait a minute, you may have a problem here with this guy, right? Well, and think about how you can now synergize your efforts to maybe confront that idea and so forth. So the idea here, I'm saying, both groups share parallel struggles, as Carter G mentions in the beginning. Carter G Woodson mentions in the beginning the two-headed monster, that is slavery and colonialism. Both those things may be different in the technicalities of it, but make no mistake, they both serve the same purpose, right? Which is to extract resources or to extract as much value out of Africa for the growth of this sort of machine that became the Western capitalist system, right? So when that resource stops being people predominantly, a la slave trade, then you go in and it becomes land and resources, and to maintain that you have to maintain the sort of power structures that come with that. So that recognition is very important, right? That's a very important parallel struggle that, as you confront it, start looking at how we can remedy it on both sides. Furthermore, the erasure that we mentioned earlier is not restricted just to Black America. It continues. Carter G. Woodson himself had written, again in very dated language, because this book came out in 1933, the parts of the world inhabited by the Caucasian were treated in the history books, right, in detail. Less attention was given to the yellow people, still less to the red, very little to the brown, and practically none to the Black race, right? So that's any place he's talking about where there's a predominance of Black people. So again, the erasure, and when you look at this quote from David Hume, who's one of the important Enlightenment era philosophers out of Scotland, he says, I'm apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites. So, and there's several quotes that talk about this. So I say this to say this idea of erasure is prominent. Wherever you go, you might see the story of slavery told in very sanitized ways, as we've been seeing lately. Or you might see ancient Egypt portrayed as being purely a white space, right? So that erasure is also a parallel struggle. Then finally, when you look back at the history of the global black community, they not only were the struggles parallel, but resistance has been parallel. So if you look back in 1899, I believe, right, in the planning to the first ever Pan-African conference, Henry Sylvester Williams, who's a barrister out of Trinidad, coined the phrase Pan-Africanism to describe, here, do I have the definition of it? But what he calls this idea of at the time it was defined here as, the meeting was designed as to protest the stealing of lands in the colonies, right, in Africa, racial discrimination, and to deal with all other issues of interest to blacks. This was the idea. So they came together, people from the Caribbean, prominent people from the Caribbean early on, because they were well positioned for that. A lot of them were very well traveled, but also they belonged to the New World, which at the time had been through slavery already. So I say their presence was very elevated compared both to Africans, who were still only getting colonized by 1900, but also a little more, or maybe on par with the black American population, which was far bigger, but because they were a little more traveled and they had what we call majority consciousness, right? They understood what it was to be a majority, being that that's who they were in the islands. In any case, I say that to say this Pan-African history gets us going in 1900. Out of that tradition comes out people like Marcus Garvey out of Jamaica. Initially, then in 1945, it moves to its epicenter to Africa, right, in the aftermath of the World War. And people like Kwame Nkrumah come in, but you see figures like Stokely Carmichael, even Malcolm X, who are prominent Pan-Africanists in their recognition of the interlinkages between these struggles. Right. Oh yeah, this is the definition I was looking for. The idea, the running definition of Pan-Africanism that we continue to use is the idea that Africans and peoples of African descent in the New World should develop racial solidarity for the purpose of abolishing discrimination and forced segregation and political and economic exploitation. So I add that to say not just the parallel struggles are parallel, but for a long time too, the fight has been parallel. Then the third reason that I think, at least in the American space, it is very important to continue to recognize the importance for this. When you talk about the combined efforts, these are not just yesteryear things, because today a lot of the things that inspired Black History Month continue to be a problem. So, for example, the impact of imperialism, the residual impact of imperialism is still around us. We see it in things like global anti-Blackness, right? I've been on study abroad with, or heard of study abroad stories with African American students who deal with the struggle here. Then they go out to some other spaces expecting slightly different dynamics, only to be hit by very similar rhetoric, right? The group that had gone to Indonesia. And I don't know much about Indonesia. I'm just talking about this very specific space that they were in, where the host parents told the chaperones, the equivalent of that, the study abroad guides, that you didn't tell us this many of your students were black. We can't do this. I'm also thinking of South Africa, which again is an African country, a majority black country. But I was over there, and a friend of mine, African American dude, had a tiny bit of weed, which by the way is illegal. Is legal. Sorry, is now legal in that space. And he, the cops really hounded us down, and, they, for lack of, slapped him, threw him in the back of the truck over that much. And it turned out to be an extortionist gig. I ended up giving them like 1,500 Rand, which is about $100 US. But that's what they wanted. But the energy of that interaction really was a relic of apartheid. And you could see this. So there's these things that continue to happen. But also, closely tied to that was with the international resistance movement. So does anybody know where this is? Virginia? Well, anybody else have any other ideas? So this is in Belgium, right? This is the statue of King Leopold II, who, as more of his story is told, is one of the biggest sort of tyrants, killed 8 million people, the Congolese people, and so forth. So again, his statue had been defaced, and the fact that you said Virginia is sort of speaks to my point, right? That this struggles, this guy is very celebrated in Virginia, in Belgium and in the colonial world. But you have these things happening. So again, there's a lot of, there was even a case in South Africa where, again, the residue of apartheid holds heavy, so that when the country went into lockdown, that was the biggest deployment of force since the end of apartheid in terms of the military being out there. And a guy was having a beer on the porch, and I guess he was supposed to be inside. He got shot, and again, a lot of the language that came out of that very much mirrored that of police brutality and so forth. So the struggles converge, not just in history, but now as well. And it's important to have this discourse, so this is the scope for it. Finally, the black experience in the U.S. When we talk about the black experience in the U.S., we can talk about Black History Month being the history of the descendants of slaves, right? Or which is a rhetoric that goes on around right now, and situates people who've been immigrants and so forth outside of that narrative. And that's faulty, because there is something about the very real lived experience of black people in the U.S., even if you've been here for a short time, even if you don't realize it, that speaks to this. For example, let me give you a couple statistics here. Think about this. Although only 7% of non-citizens in the U.S. are black, they make up 20% of those facing deportation, right? So just that disproportion. Research suggests that because black people in the United States are more likely to be stopped, arrested, and incarcerated, black immigrants may be disproportionately vulnerable to deportation. So even it knows no citizenship status, right? Once you are black in the U.S., you may be slightly differently positioned, but you are confronted with these things as well. Here's something else that I thought was incredible. It's a point I wanted to make here, which I think is very... I put the link out here. But in any case, the idea is, when you look at infant mortality rates, right, and NPR did a great study on this. When you look at infant mortality rates, the rate of infant mortality among black mothers in the U.S., right, is twice that of white mothers, almost twice that of white mothers, which is a jarring stat, right? But how does this connect to this thing? That of immigrant black mothers from the Caribbean and Africa, once they have this, when they're back in their homelands, it's also very high in many of those spaces. But once they have the access to the same resources here, that number, which one do you think is closer to, the white one or the black one? The of mortality. It's much closer to the white one, right? When they get here. Within 2 generations, however, their kids or their kids' kids is now much closer to the black American one. Which is to say, it's not a genetic thing, otherwise it would never be the same when they came in, it would be huge anyway. But the fact that within 2 generations it goes to being like this, it speaks to there's something about the lived experiences of blackness in the U.S. that sort of position, that sort of lead to that. So, and these are things that need explaining. Even something else to think about, right? When you look at the tech field, 3% of Silicon Valley is black people, even though the numbers closer of black, the population of blacks is 13 to 14%, 3%. Now there's conflicts between, some of the conflict between African Americans and the black immigrant population is, you're coming in here and you're stealing our piece of the American pie, right? In the name of diversity, because these companies will just say, oh, we have met our diversity, we are our diversity, but they fill it up with immigrants, which doesn't really do anything for the historical injustice of blackness in the U.S., right? Does that make sense? So the struggle here is, I think that anger is justified, but it's also misdirected. Our problem should not be that of that 3%, 1.5% went to immigrants, right? Our struggle is it shouldn't be 3% in the first place, right? We need to be, we make the pie bigger, don't concern about how these small groups of people are splitting it up, right? Let's make the pie bigger. So these are some of the things that I feel like, even if you situate yourself outside the history of Black History Month, the struggle confronts you right away, and it's important that we talk about these things and you understand why this anger would even exist, right? Because generations upon generations have been fighting for these freedoms, and you come in and you benefit from them, and it's not your fault. But I think it's also worth recognizing that the struggle at hand here. So I think I just have one more slide here. So what are the implications of this? So the idea here is not to dilute, as I said in the beginning, not to dilute blackness or American blackness. I think the story of the descendants of slaves in the U.S. is a very, very important and sacrosanct one that can never be diluted by saying like, well, you know, all black people are just the same, right? So the idea is to not to form for uniformity, and this is something that Carter G would recognize as well. What will help a Negro in Alabama may prove harmful to a Negro in Maine. The African Negro may find this progress retarded by implying methods used for the elevation of the Negro in America, right? These are his words, okay? And again, I keep saying that the language sounds like it does because he was writing this in the 20s and 30s. But even within the American space, he talks about that, you know, targets may, you know, the way you move in Alabama may not be how you want to move in Maine. So the idea here is for unity, solidarity, not uniformity. We are not talking about becoming the same thing or moving as the same thing, but solidarity and understanding each other's struggles and understanding our shared history, where it's shared, and what we can build off of each other. The second thing here is the concept I call pluriversalism, one that my students will be familiar with as well. The idea here is we have built systems that privilege universalism, as in there's a way of thinking. But when you think about a way of thinking, or there's a world history that matters, there's these things that matter, there's a way of doing things. But when you think about that, we find that it's typically very limiting, right? So when you think about the great empires of yesteryear, think about the Greeks and the Romans and so forth, right? You think about philosophy, you think about Plato, you think about Socrates, then you come up to the more modern era and you think about Freud and Hegel and these folks. And you're still looking at part of the world that is this big, you know, and so forth, you know, with Eastern philosophy notwithstanding. I think that's been one of the more disruptive forces, right? But, and the idea is not to dismiss those as ways of looking at the world. But for as long as you can, what's the Einstein quote? You know, everybody is smart, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, you know, it always looks like the monkey is smarter. Well, that's not what a fish is there for, right? But so the idea here is to promote pluriversalism. What I mean by pluriversalism is the Eurocentric worldview has merit, but it has to be used within the space where we're talking about Eurocentric phenomena. The Afrocentric worldview has merit, but that's what we should use when we look at those things and so forth, right? And the different worldviews that exist there. So his quote here sums up pluriversalism well. And again, I just found this as I was preparing for this presentation because I thought pluriversalism, or the advocacy thereof, was a very new phenomena. But you can tell here he's talking about this. We should emphasize not Negro history, but the Negro in history. What we need is not a history of selected races or nations, but the history of the world void of national bias, race, hate, and religious prejudice. There should be no indulgence in undue eulogy of the Negro, right? No romanticization, no fetishization of their suffering, right? The case of the Negro is well taken care of when it is shown how he has far influenced the development of civilization. So this ain't a push towards the only great thing that's ever happened came out of Africa. Or it's also, which is an overcorrection of like nothing ever came out of Africa. But let's talk about the points of interaction, right? Where did we get this? Where did we get that? The Africans who came into this space, or when the Europeans came into this, they learned this. The trade with the Arabian Peninsula, and how that molded and developed a very distinct Swahili culture on the coast of Africa, and so forth, and so many things. So this is sort of what our push is towards. First of all, not for uniformity, but for solidarity within the spirit of Black History Month, and also in the bigger picture to promote a pluriversal approach to our study of these things. And with that, I know I went way over time, but that's what I had to share with you. And oh, and the image here. Does anybody recognize this woman? Young woman, you know, really, she was 21 years old. 21 years old, out of Nigeria. Her name was Toyin, Toyin Salau, or famously known as Toyin. She was one of the leaders, or somebody who emerged as a prominent force in the Black Lives Matter, in the post George Floyd murder protest in 2020. Then she was, just a Nigerian. I don't know if she was a Nigerian immigrant or the child of a Nigerian immigrant herself, but she goes on to be very influential. 21 years old, but before the summer was done, she had been murdered. Right now, she wasn't actually murdered by anybody who was, as you may think, right, like somebody who was up against the movement. She was just kidnapped and raped by some sicko, again, actually from the community, who was, I think he had offered her a place to stay or something like that. Then he actually killed 2 people in the process. And, there was just a lot of talk about, this child, and 21 years old is a child. And I know some of you guys may be 21 or even younger. But in terms of the movement, a lot of these movements are led by people who are, they should be taken care of still as their ideas are brilliant and are moving us forward, and this, Toyin should have been taken care of. And I just use that image to talk about a place of intersection between the African community, the immigrant African community, the calls for the Black cause in the U.S., and the need for solidarity and protection in that. And with that in mind, that's my presentation. Thank you, guys.